The chaos outside is the natural state of man. Here, we offer order.
Tonight, we journey into the life and mind of Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher who understood fear as perhaps no other thinker before or since. But there's something about Hobbes that most people miss entirely, a dangerous insight he buried in his philosophy that we'll uncover near the end of our journey. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, especially if you enjoy these philosophical journeys into deep contemplation. Let me know in the comments where you're joining us from and what time it is for you. It's fascinating to connect with fellow travelers across different time zones and circumstances. Now, dim the lights, perhaps light a candle, and let's ease into tonight's philosophical journey together. In 1588 England, as rumours of the Spanish Armada spread, Thomas Hobbes's premature birth revealed a life forever linked to the presence of fear. We enter this moment as his mother gives birth under the shadow of national crisis. Can you imagine it, dear listener? You know that feeling when the news delivers something that makes your heart sink, when anxiety floods through you so powerfully it affects your entire body. That's exactly what Hobbes's mother experienced. The tension rippling through England as Philip II's massive fleet, the largest naval expedition ever assembled, sailed from Lisbon with orders to sail up the English Channel, join with Spanish forces in Flanders, and escort an invasion that would overthrow Elizabeth I and reinstate Catholicism across England. Your mother, hearing of this approaching storm of steel and faith, goes into labour 7 months early. And in that moment of vulnerability, as empires clash and nations tremble, little Thomas enters the world. Later in life, with characteristic philosophical precision, Hobbes would remark that my mother gave birth to twins, myself and fear. These words, so seemingly simple, contain the seed of an entire philosophical system, the profound understanding that human existence begins in vulnerability, and that from this primordial uncertainty springs our deepest need for security. But this need for security would eventually lead Hobbes to a controversial conclusion, one that still divides thinkers today. We'll explore why in a moment. Consider how this unusual arrival mirrors so many of our own beginnings. You might find yourself reflecting, perhaps, on the circumstances that marked your entry into this world. The economic uncertainty of your parents, the political turmoil of your era, or the family tensions that created a particular atmosphere of unease. Hobbes's childhood itself was shaped by another kind of abandonment. His father, an uneducated vicar, became involved in a fight with local clergy outside his own church and was forced to leave London, abandoning his wife and children. The young Thomas, barely more than an infant, was left in the care of his wealthy uncle Francis, a glove manufacturer. This too speaks to a fundamental human experience, the way early disruptions can create what modern psychology might call attachment issues, or what Hobbes would recognize as the foundational human condition of insecurity. You've felt this, haven't you? That gnawing uncertainty about whether you can truly rely on anyone. The child learns, even before words can form, that safety is not guaranteed, that those we depend upon may not always be there, and that the world contains forces beyond our control. Today, as we navigate our own uncertainties, perhaps economic instability, political polarization, or the subtle anxieties of modern life, we might recognize something timeless in Hobbes's early experience. The premature birth under the shadow of approaching invasion creates a metaphor for consciousness itself. We enter a world already in conflict, already shaped by forces larger than ourselves, already pregnant with the possibility of danger. This insight would later blossom into Hobbes's great philosophical system, his understanding that without proper social contracts and governing authority, human beings naturally fall into what he called the war of all against all. But there's a problem with this theory that Hobbes himself struggled with, a contradiction that we'll address later. But here, in these first moments of life, we see the genesis of this profound insight, the realization that existence begins in uncertainty, and that our deepest philosophical and practical questions all stem from this primary condition of vulnerability. As we settle into tonight's journey, let us hold this image in our minds, the philosopher born under the shadow of invasion, fear and consciousness arriving together in a moment that would shape an entire understanding of human nature. When young Thomas Hobbes was just a child, his world was suddenly shattered by a violent altercation that sent ripples through his family structure forever. His father, Thomas Sr., the vicar of Charlton and Westport, became embroiled in a fight with local clergy outside the church he served. In the aftermath of this confrontation, the elder Hobbes fled London, abandoning his young family and leaving behind a profound void in his son Thomas's life. This moment of abandonment was not just a personal family crisis, but rather it became the first and perhaps most formative lesson that the young philosopher would ever receive about the fragility of order and the ever-present possibility of chaos. In the wake of his father's departure, young Thomas was left in the care of his father's older brother, Francis Hobbes, a wealthy glove manufacturer who had no family of his own. This uncle, who became the boy's guardian, represented the very antithesis of chaos, a man of substance and order, someone who could provide stability where there had been sudden upheaval. Young Thomas was taken from Westport to Malmesbury, where he began his formal education at just 4 years old, first at Westport Church School, then at Malmesbury School itself. These early years, split between the instability of abandonment and the security of his uncle's protection, would crystallize into a fundamental insight that would later define his entire philosophical worldview. Here's what makes this fascinating. The young Hobbes, as he grew into adolescence and then into manhood, began to recognize that the duality of his childhood, the sudden collapse of family order followed by the deliberate construction of new stability, reflected a deeper truth about human society itself. He observed, even in his formative years, that the comfortable structures of civilized life, whether within a family or within a community, were not natural givens, but rather careful constructions. These structures required vigilant maintenance, constant renewal, and an understanding of their fundamental fragility. If a father's love could suddenly vanish, if a family's harmony could be disrupted by a single violent moment, what prevented entire communities from descending into similar chaos? This question, planted by childhood upheaval and nurtured by his uncle's wisdom, would eventually blossom into what we now recognize as one of the most profound insights in all of political philosophy. Thomas Hobbes, drawing from his own early experiences with the breakdown of order, came to understand that human beings, when left to their own devices, naturally tend toward a state of constant competition and mutual suspicion. And you see this every day, don't you? In modern society, we see this insight reflected in our elaborate systems of law, governance, and social contracts, the carefully constructed frameworks that channel our impulses toward cooperation rather than conflict. Every financial regulation, every social norm, every institutional structure we create is, in essence, a response to the understanding that chaos is always nearby, that order must be consciously built and maintained. In the quiet halls of Oxford, Hobbes faced the question, what if traditional learning is not enough to understand human behavior? Imagine, if you will, the young Thomas Hobbes walking beneath ancient stone archways, surrounded by centuries of accumulated wisdom, yet feeling a growing restlessness within his mind. It was the early 1600s, and Magdalen Hall stood as a bastion of scholastic learning, a place where medieval traditions of dialectical reasoning still held sway over the curriculum. Here, students were trained in the methods perfected by Thomas Aquinas and the great schoolmen, methods that sought to reconcile Aristotelian logic with Christian doctrine through careful disputation and rigorous conceptual analysis. Yet something in young Hobbes resisted this inherited framework. According to his own accounts, he was little attracted by the scholastic learning offered to him. Instead of embracing the prescribed curriculum, he followed his own intellectual path, drawn more to classical literature and the quiet certainty of mathematics than to the endless debates over abstract categories and theological distinctions. Now think about this for a moment. Have you ever sat in a classroom or training session surrounded by supposed experts, yet felt deep down that they were missing something fundamental? Consider what this meant for a young scholar in that era. Scholasticism had dominated European intellectual life for nearly 6 centuries, representing the very definition of learned discourse. Its methods, rooted in the careful analysis of texts and the resolution of contradictions through dialectical reasoning, had produced some of the greatest minds of the medieval world. To question its sufficiency was not merely an academic preference. It was to challenge the foundations of how knowledge itself was understood. Yet Hobbes sensed something vital was missing. The schoolmen could argue endlessly about the nature of being, about universals and particulars, about the proper relationship between faith and reason. But could their methods truly explain why people behave as they do? Could inherited doctrine, no matter how elegantly reasoned, capture the raw mechanics of human passion and conflict? This quiet dissatisfaction would prove to be the seed of a revolution in thought, one that would eventually challenge not just academic methodology, but the very foundations of political philosophy. Before arriving at Oxford, Hobbes had already demonstrated an unusual independence of mind. Under the tutelage of Robert Latimer, a young Oxford graduate, the precocious boy had translated Euripides' Medea from Greek into Latin verse. This was no mere academic exercise. In choosing Medea, with its dark exploration of passion, betrayal, and the terrible consequences of human emotion unchecked by reason, Hobbes had already begun to contemplate the forces that drive human action far beneath the surface of polite discourse. Think of the contrast here. On one hand, the scholastic tradition offered a world of ordered categories and rational disputations, where truth could be reached through careful logical steps. On the other hand, the classical dramatists revealed a world of violent passion, of jealousy and ambition and fear, forces that seemed to operate by their own terrible logic. In the silence of his studies, young Hobbes was beginning to ask which vision came closer to the truth of human nature. Was humanity fundamentally rational, as the schoolmen assumed? Or were we creatures of passion first, creatures whose reason serves darker masters? This tension between inherited wisdom and direct observation remains profoundly relevant in our own time. Consider how often we accept explanations simply because they come from authoritative sources, because they have been handed down through institutions we trust. You do this too, don't you? This too. You absorb political narratives, economic theories, psychological frameworks, often without asking whether these ideas truly match what you observe in the world around you. In an age of information overload, where every expert seems to contradict another, Hobbes's quiet rebellion invites us to cultivate our own powers of observation. It asks us to notice the gap between what we are told about human behavior and what we actually witness in our daily lives, in our workplaces, in our political discourse, in our own hearts. The young scholar at Oxford was learning a lesson that transcends his particular historical moment. The true understanding requires us to look beyond what we have been taught, to observe the world with fresh eyes, even when such observation challenges comfortable assumptions. And so, as we contemplate Hobbes in those quiet Oxford halls, we see the outlines of a mind preparing itself for a new kind of inquiry. He was not yet the author of Leviathan, not yet the philosopher who would articulate the war of all against all. He was simply a young man sensing that the questions which truly mattered, the questions about power, about fear, about what holds societies together and what tears them apart, could not be answered by syllogisms alone. Let that image rest gently in your mind. A scholar shaped not by what he learned, but by what he found insufficient. In his growing skepticism toward inherited doctrine, we find the first stirrings of an empirical temperament, a mind that would eventually demand to understand human nature, not as tradition wished it to be, but as observation revealed it truly was. And in that quiet dissatisfaction lies a lesson for us all. Sometimes wisdom begins not with accepting answers, but with having the courage to question them. In 1608, Hobbes stepped into aristocratic life as a tutor to the Cavendish family, discovering the political world up close. This moment reveals how proximity to power shaped his view of governance. Can you imagine the young philosopher, fresh from Cambridge's halls, walking through the great doors of Hardwicke Hall? Here was William Cavendish, not yet the Earl of Devonshire, but already moving in circles where policy was discussed over wine, where decisions made in these rooms would ripple across England's counties. This wasn't merely a teaching position, it was an apprenticeship in power itself, and in that apprenticeship Hobbes began to see something that would haunt his later writings: the delicate balance upon which all authority rests. The core insight that emerged from these years was both profound and unsettling. Authority is both necessary and deeply fragile. Observe the Cavendish household, servants taking orders from their betters, tenants looking to their landlords for guidance, local magistrates deferring to noble families. Yet beneath this ordered surface, Hobbes watched the constant negotiations, the subtle tensions, the ways ambitious men and women positioned themselves for advantage. He saw how easily respect could turn to resentment, how quickly deference might dissolve into defiance. Power, he realized, was not like a stone wall, solid and permanent, but more like a delicate web, beautiful in its complexity yet vulnerable to the slightest disturbance. Modern politics still echoes with similar tensions between stability and ambition. In our corporate boardrooms, in our political campaigns, in our social media discourse, we witness the same fundamental dynamic Hobbes observed in the Cavendish salons: the perpetual dance between those who seek to maintain order and those who aspire to reshape it. The contemporary political figure who campaigns on disrupting the establishment faces the same paradox that troubled Hobbes: how to harness the energy of ambition while channeling it into constructive rather than destructive forms. The startup founder who builds a company encounters the same challenge the young Hobbes witnessed in aristocratic politics: how to maintain the loyalty and cooperation necessary for collective endeavor while managing the inevitable personal ambitions that threaten it. These tensions reveal something profound about human nature itself. You can use this understanding to recognize how power structures influence your own environments. Whether in the workplace, in community organizations, or within families, the same dynamic forces are at play. The need for coordination and order balanced against the natural human drive for autonomy and recognition. This awareness offers a more nuanced lens for understanding the systems that shape our daily lives. And as we rest with this thought, we prepare to journey deeper into how these early observations would blossom into one of history's most controversial theories of human nature. In the autumn of 1636, during his travels through Italy with the Cavendish family, Thomas Hobbes found himself in Florence, standing before one of the great minds of the age. What happened in that meeting would change everything Hobbes believed about truth and authority, but it also planted the seeds of a troubling question he'd wrestle with for the rest of his life. Galileo Galilei, the astronomer whose telescopes had torn through centuries of inherited wisdom like gentle thunder, received the English philosopher in his villa at Arcetri. The meeting between these two minds, one already grappling with the foundations of political authority, the other reshaping humanity's understanding of the cosmos, would leave an indelible mark on Hobbes's thinking about how knowledge, truth, and power intertwine in human society. Tonight, we journey into that transformative encounter. Imagine, if you will, Hobbes listening as the aged Galileo carefully explained how his observations of Jupiter's moons had dismantled the ancient celestial spheres. Here was empirical evidence, gathered through simple glass lenses, that overturned the astronomical beliefs passed down through generations of scholars. The English tutor witnessed something profound, the shocking realization that observation and reason could fracture even the most deeply entrenched systems of thought. This was not merely about astronomy, but about the very method by which humans could distinguish between appearance and reality, between authority and truth. But Italy was not Hobbes's only destination on this intellectual pilgrimage. In Paris, he encountered the circle of Marin Mersenne, that remarkable friar whose correspondence network connected the greatest minds of Europe. Through Mersenne's salon, Hobbes engaged with thinkers wrestling with the same questions about how to build knowledge on firmer foundations. These encounters, both in Florence and Paris, crystallized a crucial insight that would echo throughout his later political philosophy. If the natural world required rational foundations, observable, testable, repeatable principles, then surely human societies demanded the same rigorous approach. The medieval hierarchies that claimed divine authority for political power suddenly seemed as fragile as the earth-centered universe that Galileo had proven false. What if political systems, like astronomical theories, needed to be built not on tradition or inherited claims, but on clear reasoning about human nature and the practical requirements of peaceful coexistence? This question would guide Hobbes toward his revolutionary theory of the social contract. Today, as we navigate our own age of technological upheaval, we find ourselves in a remarkably similar position to those witnessing Galileo's telescopic revelations. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cryptocurrency, each advancement challenges established ways of organizing economic life, social relationships, and governance structures. And you feel this disruption, don't you? That sense that the old rules no longer apply, that everything you thought was stable is suddenly uncertain. Like Hobbes watching Jupiter's moons through Galileo's telescope, we observe systems being overturned by evidence of what is possible when human ingenuity is applied with method and purpose. The question that confronted Hobbes in that Parisian salon remains relevant. Will we cling to outdated frameworks, or will we embrace the rational foundations necessary for new forms of human flourishing? Perhaps the greatest lesson from Hobbes's European journey is this: change, however disruptive, offers an opportunity for clearer understanding. When old certainties crumble, we are compelled to build new ones, not on tradition or authority, but on reasoned analysis of what serves human needs most effectively. Keep this insight in mind. We'll return to it when we explore Hobbes's most radical idea. For now, rest in the knowledge that every revolution, whether in the heavens or in human affairs, began with someone willing to question what everyone else assumed to be true. In the 1640s, as England collapsed into civil war, Hobbes saw his worst fears materialize. The very fabric of society that had held the kingdom together for generations began to tear apart, revealing the raw, primal forces that Hobbes had long suspected lurked beneath the surface of civilization. This is where Hobbes's philosophy stops being abstract and becomes terrifyingly real. It was as if the entire nation had become a living laboratory of his philosophical darkest predictions, where neighbors turned against neighbors, where the king's authority crumbled into dust, and where the peaceful order of everyday life dissolved into chaos and violence. The English Civil War, spanning from 1642 to 1651, presented a terrifying spectacle of fragmentation. The kingdom split cleanly down the middle, royalists clinging to the countryside and cathedral cities of York, Chester, Worcester, and Oxford, while parliamentarians consolidated power in the industrial centres and ports of southern and eastern England. Historians have noted how the words populous, rich, and rebellious seemed to go hand in hand during this period. What struck Hobbes most profoundly was not merely the political division, but the complete breakdown of social trust itself. When 120,000 to 150,000 soldiers took to the field during campaign seasons, England's sons found themselves facing their brothers across battle lines, guided by competing visions of justice and order that could not coexist. The philosophical insight Hobbes drew from this chaos was stark and unforgiving. Without strong, centralized authority, humans inevitably revert to their natural state of conflict. The Civil War had revealed something disturbing about human nature, that beneath the veneer of civilization, we carry within us the capacity for devastating violence when proper authority collapses. But even more disturbing was how quickly this collapse occurred, how rapidly a peaceful society could transform into what Hobbes would later call the war of all against all. The execution of Charles I in 1649, once considered impossible, became reality when no authority remained strong enough to protect even the king himself. And here's what should concern you. Today, we witness similar patterns of breakdown in our polarized society, the erosion of shared truth, the demonization of political opponents, and the gradual normalization of violence. Hobbes's insight becomes remarkably relevant. These fragments of discord, when left unchecked, can cascade into the very chaos he feared most. Yet his solution was not despair, but the careful construction of cooperative structures that recognize our tendency toward conflict while channeling it toward peaceful resolution. In our own communities, we can build bridges before the bridges burn, creating spaces where dialogue replaces division and where the common good transcends personal animosity. As we drift towards sleep, let us consider how peace itself is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of structures strong enough to hold our inevitable disagreements without allowing them to destroy what we hold dear. What if human beings, left alone, fall irresistibly into competition and fear? This is the question that haunts every political system ever created. This question frames Hobbes's view of the state of nature. It reveals his belief that insecurity, not evil, drives conflict. Picture, if you will, a moment of solitude, not in a peaceful garden, but in a world where no governing hand protects you from another's intentions. In this imagined space, every person you encounter becomes a potential threat, not because they are malicious by nature, but because they, like you, are driven by fundamental needs and desires. This is the profound insight of Hobbes's Leviathan, written during the turmoil of England's Civil War in 1651. He observed that when people lack a common authority to keep them in check, they exist in what he called the war of all against all, bellum omnium contra omnis. Yet notice how carefully he crafts this concept. It's not that humans are inherently wicked, but that they are inherently vulnerable. In a world without protection, the reasonable person learns to strike first, not from cruelty, but from a perfectly rational self-preservation. Consider how this ancient insight speaks to our digital age. Today's social media disputes, The polarization in public discourse, the way online conversations so quickly escalate into personal attacks, all of these reflect what Hobbes recognized centuries ago. Nan, you've experienced this yourself, haven't you? When people feel unprotected, when they sense that their words might go unchecked, the instinct is to dominate before being dominated. The fear of being silenced or overlooked creates its own form of warfare, and so we can gently turn our attention to the practical wisdom this offers. When you recognize that the sharp words, the competitive postures, the defensive reactions around you stem not from malice, but from a deep, human need for security, something remarkable happens. You begin to respond from a place of understanding rather than reactivity. The knowledge that insecurity drives conflict becomes itself a source of calm. In this recognition, we find not just intellectual insight, but a pathway to greater peace in our daily encounters. Imagine a world without rules, where survival dictates every choice. Let that image settle in your mind. In this imagined realm, there are no laws to protect you, no authorities to appeal to, no established boundaries between what is yours and what belongs to another. Each person stands as both judge and executioner of their own fate. This is the state of nature that Thomas Hobbes describes with such stark precision in his seminal work, Leviathan. It is here, in this philosophical thought experiment, that we encounter one of the most sobering observations in all of political philosophy, that life in such conditions becomes, as Hobbes famously wrote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But why does freedom without structure transform into danger? And what does this ancient insight reveal about our modern world? To understand Hobbes's profound insight, we must examine the fundamental psychology he identified in human nature. In the state of nature, each person possesses what he called a right of nature, the freedom to use their own power to preserve their own life. This might sound liberating, but Hobbes recognized a cruel paradox. When everyone has unlimited freedom, no one is truly free. Why? Because in the absence of common authority, people become locked in what he termed a war of all against all. Imagine this, and really try to feel it, being perpetually vigilant, never knowing when your neighbor might decide that your resources, your land, or even your life itself would be useful to them. The natural result is that everyone becomes everyone else's enemy, not from malevolence necessarily, but from the simple mathematics of scarcity and the uncertainty of others' intentions. This creates what Hobbes called a condition of mutual diffidence, a deep, chronic mistrust that permeates every interaction. And so, we can gently turn our attention to how this ancient philosophical insight illuminates our contemporary digital landscape. Consider the early days of social media platforms, or anonymous forums, or cryptocurrency markets, spaces that began with minimal regulation and maximal freedom. What happened? Just as Hobbes predicted, we witnessed the emergence of digital wars of all against all. Without established norms and enforcement mechanisms, harassment proliferated, misinformation spread unchecked, and the most aggressive voices often drowned out thoughtful discourse. We saw how the absence of shared authority transformed spaces meant for connection into arenas of conflict and exploitation. The parallel is striking. Just as in Hobbes's state of nature, the promise of unlimited freedom in these digital realms paradoxically created environments where genuine freedom became increasingly difficult to sustain. But here, in this realization, lies perhaps the most practical wisdom from Hobbes's state of nature, the recognition that we must consciously create boundaries to protect what we value most. On a personal level, this means establishing clear limits in our digital consumption, curating our feeds, setting time boundaries, creating spaces free from the war of all against all mentality that pervades much of online discourse. Just as Hobbes argued that individuals must surrender some natural freedom to gain the security of social contract, we too can choose to limit our exposure to chaos in exchange for greater mental peace and authentic connection. The state of nature teaches us that true security comes not from the absence of rules, but from the presence of wisely chosen boundaries that serve the deeper purpose of preserving what matters most. And in this understanding, we find not fear of freedom, but wisdom in its thoughtful organization. What if peace is something we construct rather than inherit? This profound question lies at the heart of Thomas Hobbes's revolutionary insight in his masterwork, Leviathan. Picture, if you will, a world where harmony doesn't naturally emerge from our shared humanity, but must be deliberately, consciously built by collective agreement. Hobbes understood something that would forever change how we think about society, that the quiet security you feel tonight in your own space, the certainty that someone won't break down your door, that your neighbors won't steal what you've worked to accumulate, that your community has shared rules. This security is not the natural order of things. It is, quite remarkably, a human creation. Hobbes conceived of the social contract during one of history's most turbulent periods. The English Civil War raged from 1642 to 1651, when Hobbes wrote Leviathan. He witnessed firsthand what happens when the bonds that hold society together begin to fray, when neighbors become enemies, when religious conviction turns to violence, when the very fabric of civilization seems to unravel at the seams. In this chaos, Hobbes asked a question that would echo through centuries. How do we escape the war of all against all? His answer was brilliant in its simplicity and profound in its implications. We must deliberately choose to surrender certain freedoms in exchange for collective security. Consider the frontispiece of Leviathan itself, a giant sovereign figure whose body is composed of hundreds of individual faces, all turned away from the viewer. This was Hobbes's visual metaphor for something extraordinary, that sovereignty is not imposed from above, but emerges from the people themselves. We, the individual citizens, collectively agree to form this greater body politic. We choose to bind ourselves to common laws, common institutions, common purpose. The fear that once drove us to constant vigilance, to the endless suspicion that our neighbor might be plotting our downfall, can be transformed into the calm confidence of shared responsibility. But this transformation requires our active participation, our deliberate choice to cooperate. This insight resonates powerfully in our modern world. Every democracy you've ever participated in, every civic organization you've joined, every neighborhood watch, every community garden, all of these are contemporary expressions of Hobbes's social contract. We gather together not because cooperation comes naturally to us, but because we've learned that constructed peace is infinitely preferable to the chaos of unbridled individualism. In your own relationships, this principle applies as well. The agreements you make with friends, the boundaries you establish with family, the commitments you honor in your community, these are your personal social contracts, crafted consciously to create islands of security in the uncertain sea of human interaction. And so we discover that Hobbes's greatest gift to us is not just a theory about government, but a profound truth about human possibility, that peace, security, and cooperation are not gifts we receive, but creations we choose to build together, one deliberate agreement at a time. In 1651, Hobbes envisioned a sovereign so strong that no chaos could overrun society again. But here's where things get controversial, and where many misunderstand what Hobbes was actually proposing. We explore this bold solution as an answer to relentless disorder. His insight is that authority prevents collapse by channeling human impulses. Today, debates over governance still hinge on this balance between freedom and security. Viewers can reflect on the structures they rely on for stability. And so, we turn to this masterpiece of political philosophy that Hobbes named with an ancient, awe-inspiring title, Leviathan, not merely a book, but a vision of order emerging from the depths of human chaos. Picture, if you will, the world Hobbes witnessed during England's civil wars, cities burning, neighbours turning against neighbours, the very foundations of society trembling. In this crucible of disorder, Hobbes conceived something unprecedented, a sovereign power so absolute, so encompassing, that it could channel the relentless human drive for self-preservation into peaceful coexistence. The Leviathan itself, an image borrowed from the biblical book of Job, serves as more than mere metaphor. Hobbes, working with artist Abraham Bosse, crafted a frontispiece where a giant crowned figure emerges from the landscape, its body composed of hundreds of individual faces turned away from the viewer. This sovereign body represents something profound, the unity of separate individuals bound into a single protective entity. Just as the biblical Leviathan is described as having scales closely compacted together, so too is the political Leviathan formed by citizens joining their separate powers into one unified authority. The sovereign holds both sword and crosier, temporal and spiritual power unified. Not because Hobbes believed in theocracy, but because he recognized that true authority must be undivided to be effective. Division of authority, he argued, means the end of authority itself. But let us consider what this sovereign actually does in Hobbes's vision. And pay attention here, because this changes everything you might think you know about Hobbes. The Leviathan doesn't merely suppress, it transforms. By providing security, it allows human energies to flow away from constant vigilance and toward the pursuits that make life worth living. Commerce, art, family, the quiet cultivation of knowledge. The state of nature, remember, is one of scarcity where every person's reason tells them that others are potential threats. But under the Leviathan's protection, scarcity can be addressed through organized cooperation. The fear that drives people apart can be channeled into the fear of the sovereign's power, the fear that keeps the peace. This is Hobbes's brilliant paradox, that to be truly free, we must first surrender our natural freedom to an authority that can guarantee our survival and our ability to pursue happiness. The individual citizen becomes both subject and part of the sovereign body, a duality that would puzzle political philosophers for centuries to come. Today, we see echoes of Hobbes's insight in the structures that surround us, often unnoticed yet essential. You rely on these every single day without realizing it. Consider the traffic system that allows millions to move through cities with minimal collision, the invisible web of laws that enables strangers to interact with confidence, the institutions that, imperfectly yet persistently, prevent the war of all against all that Hobbes warned would otherwise be our natural condition. Modern debates about security versus freedom, whether in discussions of surveillance, border control, or pandemic response, reveal how deeply Hobbes's insight resonates. The tension between individual liberty and collective security remains as relevant today as it was in the aftermath of England's civil wars. Yet Hobbes's vision also challenges us to ask, what level of authority are we willing to accept to maintain the peace? How much individual autonomy must we surrender to ensure that our children can sleep safely, that markets can function, that strangers can trust each other with their lives and livelihoods? What if fear guides more of our decisions than we realize? Take a moment to consider this possibility. Thomas Hobbes, writing in the aftermath of England's devastating civil war, proposed something that might initially seem unsettling, that fear drives most human behavior. This insight, which he developed in his masterpiece Leviathan, reveals a profound truth about our daily existence. It explains why people often cling to safety, even when that safety comes at the cost of freedom itself. For Hobbes, this wasn't merely psychological observation, it was foundational to understanding society itself. In what he called the state of nature, that primordial condition before government and social contracts, humans lived in what he famously termed bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all. In this harsh reality, every person lived in constant fear of others, knowing that without a common power to keep everyone in check, life would indeed be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This fear wasn't peripheral to human nature, it was central to it. People would sacrifice almost anything, even their natural liberties, to escape this perpetual anxiety. The social contract, according to Hobbes, emerged not from reason alone, but from this primal understanding that collective security was worth individual freedom. And so, we can see how this ancient insight illuminates our modern world. Think about your own life for a moment. In contemporary life, anxiety appears in everything from career choices to relationships. Consider how many people remain in unfulfilling jobs simply because the unknown feels more threatening than the familiar dissatisfaction. You might be doing this right now. Or think about social media. How many of our choices are driven by fear of judgment, fear of missing out, fear of being forgotten? In politics, we witness this daily. Citizens willingly trading privacy for security, accepting restrictions on movement for the promise of protection. Even in intimate relationships, fear of abandonment often drives people to compromise their authentic selves, to become who they think others want, rather than who they truly are. These patterns reflect exactly what Hobbes observed centuries ago, how the anticipation of harm can overshadow the pursuit of genuine flourishing. But here's where Hobbes's insight becomes genuinely liberating. He showed us that acknowledging fear's power, rather than denying it, allows us to work with it more skillfully. When we recognize that our anxiety about security, belonging, or survival is shaping our choices, we gain the possibility of choice itself. Ask yourself right now, am I choosing this path because it feels safe, or because it aligns with my deepest values? This doesn't mean abandoning all caution. Hobbes taught us that some fear is rational and protective. Rather, it means becoming conscious of when fear is the silent puppet master of our decisions. In this awareness, we find the space to choose differently, not from panic, but from wisdom. And perhaps this is Hobbes's greatest gift, showing us that understanding our fears is the first step toward living more freely within them. In Hobbes's framework, cooperation emerges only when conflict becomes unbearable. This seems counterintuitive to our modern sensibilities, doesn't it? We like to believe that humans naturally gravitate toward harmony, that cooperation is our default state. But Hobbes observed something darker and perhaps more realistic about human nature. In his view, we don't cooperate because we see the wisdom in working together. We cooperate because the alternative, continued conflict, becomes so exhausting, so destructive, that we're driven to seek relief. It's like being in a room with stale air. Most of us won't open a window until the air becomes so stuffy, so oppressive, that we can barely breathe. Then we act, but only then. This scenario examines why humans unite only under pressure, and it's perhaps one of Hobbes's most challenging insights about our nature. Think about how this plays out in international relations. The United Nations, for instance, was born from the ashes of World War II, a conflict so devastating that nations finally felt compelled to create a mechanism for collective security. They didn't form this cooperation out of enlightened idealism. Though that became part of the narrative later, they did it because the alternative, the possibility of another global war, had become unthinkable. Similarly, the European Union emerged not from some grand vision of unity, but from the ruins of two devastating continental wars that left Europe exhausted and desperate for a new arrangement. And so we can gently turn our attention to Hobbes's insight that peace is built from necessity, not idealism. This is perhaps his most profound and most unsettling contribution to political philosophy. We tell ourselves stories about peace, that it's what humans naturally desire, that it's the default state toward which all societies naturally evolve. But Hobbes argues differently. Peace, he suggests, is an artificial construction, something we build only when the cost of conflict becomes too high to bear. It's a mechanism of survival rather than a flowering of human goodness. And this creates a troubling question we'll need to address. If peace is only born from exhaustion, can it ever be truly stable? This creates a fascinating tension in how we understand cooperation and conflict in human society. Our global challenges today, from climate change to economics, demonstrate this Hobbesian dynamic in stark relief. Climate change, for instance, requires unprecedented global cooperation, yet meaningful international action has been frustratingly slow. We have the scientific knowledge, the technological capability, even the economic models to address it. But what we're lacking is the collective will, because the costs of inaction, while enormous, are still distributed, still abstract, still not immediate enough to feel unbearable for most people. You see this in your own life, don't you? The way we postpone difficult changes until crisis forces our hand. Only when the consequences become undeniable, when the floods and fires and extreme weather make the status quo impossible to maintain, do we finally act. It's a perfect illustration of Hobbes's principle. We cooperate when conflict with nature, with future generations, with the physics of our atmosphere, becomes unbearable. Imagine a person granted unlimited freedom with no accountability. Picture someone who can act on every impulse, pursue every desire, harm without consequence, take without permission. This scenario reveals Hobbes's profound warning that unchecked freedom grows destructive. Not because humans are inherently evil, but because without structure, the very freedom that should nurture our humanity instead devours it. His insight cuts through our modern romanticization of complete liberty. Limits protect, not restrict, our humanity. Hobbes understood this through his famous examination of what he called the state of nature, a condition of absolute freedom where no authority exists to arbitrate between conflicting desires. In this imagined realm, each person possesses what he termed the right to all things, a doctrine that sounds liberating until we consider its logical conclusion. When everyone may rightfully claim everything, no one actually possesses anything securely. The very abundance of freedom creates a scarcity of peace, a paradox that Hobbes saw as inevitable in any system without reciprocal limitations. This insight becomes powerfully clear when we examine contemporary phenomena that mirror Hobbes's predictions. Digital anonymity, for instance, creates spaces where individuals operate without the normal constraints of face-to-face accountability. You've witnessed this yourself, haven't you? What emerges often includes harassment, the spread of misinformation, and behavior that people would never exhibit in their physical communities. Similarly, political extremism flourishes when echo chambers eliminate exposure to opposing viewpoints, creating intellectual spaces where radical ideas can grow unchecked by rational discourse. But perhaps most telling is how this plays out in our personal relationships and social structures. When we remove all filters from our communication, when we pursue every immediate gratification, regardless of its impact on others, we discover something troubling. Unlimited freedom often leads to profound isolation. Without the gentle boundaries that help us navigate social existence, we become prisoners of our own impulses, trapped in cycles of conflict and dissatisfaction. This is the paradox Hobbes wants us to grasp. Hobbes's genius was recognizing that the social contract, those mutual agreements that limit our absolute freedom, is not a betrayal of liberty, but its very foundation. When a leader must choose between strict order and personal compassion, we see Hobbes's dilemma unfold. This moment highlights the tension inherent in authority. Picture, if you will, a community facing crisis, perhaps a pandemic requiring strict quarantine, or an economic emergency demanding difficult decisions. The leader stands at the intersection of two powerful forces, the need to maintain order and stability, and the human instinct to show mercy and understanding. And if you've ever been in a position of responsibility, you know exactly how paralyzing this choice can be. This is where we encounter one of the most profound challenges that Hobbes anticipated in his thinking about sovereignty and social contracts. Hobbes understood that true authority is not merely about power, but about responsibility, the weight of ensuring that the social contract remains intact. When the sovereign, whether a monarch or governing body, makes decisions that affect the community, they carry the burden of preserving the very peace that the social contract was designed to create. This responsibility extends far beyond personal preference or individual conscience. Consider Hobbes's insight that the sovereign must sometimes make decisions that appear harsh or uncaring, precisely because showing preference or partiality could undermine the foundational principle that all citizens are equally protected under the contract. The authority figure becomes, in a sense, a guardian of the social peace itself. The modern workplace offers us a daily laboratory for observing these principles in action. A manager facing budget cuts must decide between maintaining team morale and making necessary reductions, a choice that mirrors Hobbes's tension between compassion and order. Similarly, a community leader dealing with housing shortages must balance empathy for those in need with the practical requirements of urban planning and resource allocation. These scenarios illuminate what Hobbes recognized centuries ago, that leadership always involves managing competing legitimate claims and interests. The responsible leader cannot simply follow their personal feelings. They must consider the broader implications for the stability and well-being of the entire community. The insight that emerges from reflecting on authority and responsibility is that effective leadership requires what we might call principled flexibility. This means maintaining clear, consistent standards while remaining responsive to human needs and changing circumstances. It's neither the cold rigidity of pure authoritarianism nor the chaos of unrestrained compassion. Instead, it's the thoughtful application of core principles, much like Hobbes's social contract itself, designed to preserve the essential conditions for human flourishing. In your own daily life, whether you're leading teams, raising families, or participating in community decisions, you can practice this balanced approach by setting clear expectations while remaining genuinely caring and responsive to individual circumstances. This is perhaps the most practical application of Hobbes's wisdom, that true authority serves not itself, but the greater peace and stability that allows all to thrive. What if security is the root of all human aspiration? Thomas Hobbes believed with unwavering certainty that safety was not merely one human need among many, but rather the very foundation upon which all flourishing must rest. This profound insight reveals why people throughout history have made seemingly irrational sacrifices for stability, sometimes freedom, sometimes comfort, sometimes even their individual dignity. The great Leviathan, That magnificent metaphor for sovereign power that Hobbes crafted was essentially a security apparatus, not a tool of oppression, but rather humanity's collective agreement to surrender certain freedoms precisely because security creates the conditions for life to truly flourish. In Hobbes's vision of the state of nature, that primordial condition before social contracts, we encounter perhaps the most comprehensive analysis of human insecurity ever written. He described it as a state where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, not merely because of physical dangers, but because of the constant, gnawing uncertainty that prevents any meaningful human development. In such conditions, the human mind cannot truly engage with beauty, create lasting art, develop complex relationships, or pursue knowledge for its own sake. Every moment must be dedicated to survival, making higher aspirations impossible. This is why Hobbes insisted that the social contract is not about creating a perfect society, but about establishing the basic security that enables human potential to unfold. Today's unprecedented emphasis on mental health and financial security reveals how deeply Hobbes's insights resonate with contemporary human experience. We see this in the way modern societies prioritize infrastructure that protects us from life's uncertainties, insurance systems, healthcare networks, retirement plans, and psychological support services. The mindfulness movement, the surge in therapy and counseling, the growing awareness of work-life balance, these all reflect an intuitive understanding that human flourishing requires a foundation of psychological and material security. Think about your own anxieties. How many of them ultimately trace back to questions of security? When we examine social media, the constant sharing of self-care tips, emergency fund strategies, and mental health resources, we witness millions of people intuitively applying Hobbesian principles to their daily lives. They understand, perhaps without realizing it, that security is not the enemy of growth. It is growth's essential precondition. For each of us listening tonight, this insight offers a practical framework for understanding our own aspirations and decisions. When we choose to sacrifice immediate pleasure for long-term stability, when we invest time in building relationships that provide mutual security, when we create routines and structures that protect our mental well-being, we are participating in the very same human project that Hobbes identified centuries ago. The foundations that support well-being, the stable relationships, the secure employment, the health practices, the financial planning, all of these are modern manifestations of the fundamental human drive for security that Hobbes recognized as the root of our deepest aspirations. And so, as we drift towards sleep tonight, we can rest in the understanding that our pursuit of security is not a limitation on our humanity, but rather the very mechanism that makes our humanity possible. In seeking safety, we are preparing the ground for all other forms of human flourishing to bloom. Hobbes saw political centralization as essential long before modern states existed. In 1651, when he published Leviathan during the tumultuous English Civil War, he wrote about the need for an absolute sovereign to prevent the war of all against all. Yet here we are, nearly 4 centuries later, watching the very same tensions play out in contemporary politics. How did a philosopher writing in the midst of 17th century English conflict help shape the way we understand governance today? Consider the frontispiece of Leviathan itself, that haunting image of a giant crowned figure emerging from hundreds of individual faces, holding both sword and crozier. This wasn't merely artistic flourish. It was Hobbes's vision of how individual citizens must unite into a single, powerful body politic. In modern constitutional governments, we see echoes of this principle. Strong federal institutions that can act decisively when society threatens to fragment. The debates we witness today about federal power versus states' rights, about the authority of central government to enforce law and order, these conversations were presciently mapped out by Hobbes centuries ago. But perhaps most remarkably, Hobbes understood something that we see playing out daily in our current information age. He recognized that without shared institutions to establish truth and authority, society dissolves into competing narratives of reality. And you experience this fragmentation every single day. In our time of social media, echo chambers and alternative facts, when different groups cannot agree on basic facts, we're experiencing what Hobbes called the state of nature. Not in terms of physical violence, but in terms of epistemic chaos. The authority of institutions like courts, scientific bodies, and electoral systems to establish objective truth represents our modern equivalent of Hobbes's sovereign power. Today's political tensions, the anxiety about political polarization, the calls for stronger institutions, the fear of democratic backsliding, these are not new concerns, but rather the latest chapter in an ongoing story that Hobbes began telling. He warned us that without sufficient central authority, we'd face not just policy disagreements, but the breakdown of social order itself. Understanding current events through Hobbes's lens doesn't diminish our democratic ideals, but rather helps us appreciate why strong, legitimate institutions remain as crucial today as they were when he first described their necessity. The challenge, as always, is ensuring that power serves the people rather than the other way around. And this brings us back to that troubling paradox we mentioned earlier. Hobbes anticipated that societies would constantly renegotiate their agreements. This scenario reveals how adaptable human systems must be. His insight is that contracts evolve with circumstances. As we consider this profound observation, let us reflect upon how remarkably prescient Hobbes truly was. The great English philosopher, writing in the 17th century during the tumultuous aftermath of civil war, understood something about human nature that would echo through the centuries. He realized that the social contract, that fundamental agreement between individuals and their governing authority, could never be a static, unchanging document. Like the ever-flowing river that reshapes its banks with each season, he saw how political arrangements must adapt to the changing landscape of human needs and expectations. Modern democracies echo this with shifting norms and expectations. Think for a moment about your own democratic society. How different are the conversations happening today from those of 50 years ago, or even 20? Consider the evolution of civil rights movements, the growing awareness of environmental imperatives, the transformation of our understanding about privacy in the digital age. These shifts represent what Hobbes might have called the natural renegotiation of the social contract. Just as individuals in his hypothetical state of nature might reconsider their initial surrender of freedoms to gain greater security, contemporary citizens constantly weigh which aspects of liberty they might exchange for collective benefits, whether through taxation for healthcare, regulation for environmental protection, or sacrifice of certain privacy rights for enhanced public safety. The beautiful thing about Hobbes's vision is that it doesn't demand perfection from our systems, but rather calls for their responsiveness. When we observe how constitutional democracies adapt through judicial interpretation, legislative reform, and constitutional amendments, we see the living embodiment of Hobbes's insight. Each generation essentially asks the question, given our current circumstances, what arrangement of authority and obligation serves us best? This is not weakness in a system, but rather its greatest strength, the capacity for what we might call democratic evolution. The social contract becomes not a chain that binds us to past decisions, but a living document that reflects our present understanding of security, freedom, and mutual responsibility. Viewers can apply it by staying flexible in their personal commitments. Here, perhaps, is where Hobbes's wisdom becomes most personally relevant. Consider your own relationships, your career commitments, your civic participation. The same principles that govern healthy societies can guide our individual lives. What seems like the perfect arrangement today may need gentle renegotiation tomorrow, not because you were wrong before, but because circumstances change, people grow, and understanding deepens. The rigid adherence to agreements made in ignorance of future realities can become as dangerous to personal happiness as Hobbes's war of all against all was to human security. But the wise renegotiation of commitments, conducted with good faith and mutual respect, allows us to maintain the security of our bonds while honoring the evolution of our needs and understanding. What if inner peace mirrors the structure of a well-ordered society? Consider this possibility as you rest in the quiet of this moment. Throughout our journey with Thomas Hobbes, we have explored his vision of the state of nature, that realm of chaos where life was, as he so memorably wrote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. We have walked through his arguments for the social contract, for the necessity of sovereign power to establish peace among competing human desires. But now, in this gentle hour, let us turn inward. Let us consider how the same principles that Hobbes believed could bring order to society might also illuminate the landscape of our own minds. Within each of us, there exists a kind of inner commonwealth. Your thoughts, your desires, your fears, your aspirations, they are like citizens of a nation, each with their own agenda, their own competing claims upon your attention and energy. You know this internal conflict intimately, don't you? Without some organizing principle, without some internal sovereign to mediate between these rival impulses, we experience what Hobbes might have recognized as a war within, a conflict that leaves us exhausted, anxious, and perpetually unsettled. The restless mind that cannot sleep, the heart that races with unnamed worries, the sense of being pulled in countless directions. These are the symptoms of an inner state of nature, where no authority has been established to keep the peace. When Hobbes wrote his masterwork Leviathan in 1651, during the tumult of the English Civil War, he understood something profound about the human condition. He recognized that freedom without structure is not truly freedom at all, but rather a kind of bondage to chaos. The famous frontispiece of Leviathan depicts a giant figure composed of countless smaller individuals, all united under a single sovereign head. Each person retains their identity, yet together they form something greater, something capable of providing the security and peace that no individual could achieve alone. Now, imagine your own mind as such a figure. Your many thoughts and feelings, rather than warring against one another, might be gathered under a unified sense of purpose, creating internal harmony from what was once discord. This insight resonates remarkably with modern approaches to mental wellness. Consider how cognitive behavioral therapy establishes clear boundaries between helpful and harmful thought patterns. Consider how mindfulness practices create structure through ritual, through the discipline of returning again and again to the breath. Even the simple act of maintaining a consistent sleep schedule represents a kind of internal social contract, an agreement between the different aspects of yourself that certain rules will be honored for the greater good of your well-being. When you create a bedtime routine, when you set boundaries around your attention, when you establish clear expectations for how you will treat your own mind and body, you are acting as the sovereign of your inner commonwealth, bringing Hobbesian order to the chaos of competing impulses. And so, as you rest here in this tranquil space between waking and sleeping, Perhaps you can feel a gentle sense of order settling over you. The rules need not be harsh. The boundaries need not be rigid. Like a wise sovereign who governs with the consent and well-being of the governed in mind, you can establish inner structures that support rather than restrict, that liberate rather than confine. Let this be the quiet teaching of Thomas Hobbes for your evening, that peace, whether in nations or in hearts, emerges not from the absence of structure, but from its thoughtful presence. In order, there is rest. In boundaries, there is freedom. And in the well-governed mind, there is at last the possibility of peace. Imagine a life where freedom and security support, not oppose, each other. This is perhaps the most profound insight Thomas Hobbes offers us, that harmony comes not from choosing one over the other, but from thoughtful negotiation between our deepest needs. Throughout our journey together, we have explored how Hobbes witnessed the fragility of social order, how he witnessed humanity at its most vulnerable, stripped of the protections that civilization provides. But his deepest wisdom lies not in depicting our fears, it lies in showing us how we might transcend them. The philosopher understood that we are beings caught between two fundamental drives: the desire to live freely, to express our authentic selves, and the need to feel safe, to know that tomorrow will bring not destruction, but the possibility of continuation. And so, we can gently turn our attention to how these seemingly opposing forces might dance together rather than battle against each other. Hobbes's thought encourages seeking balance rather than extremes. When we examine his political philosophy, what emerges is not the image of a tyrant crushing freedom, but of a thoughtful architect designing systems where security creates the foundation upon which liberty can flourish. Think of it as a garden. The strongest, most beautiful growth happens not when we remove all boundaries, nor when we enclose everything in rigid walls, but when we create thoughtful structures that provide support while allowing for natural development. The social contract that Hobbes describes is precisely this: a negotiated agreement where individuals surrender certain freedoms not to become slaves, but to gain something more precious: the freedom to pursue their lives without the constant anxiety of violence, the liberty to develop their talents without the fear that everything might be taken away. In our contemporary world, we see this balance tested daily. Technology offers us unprecedented freedom of expression and connection, yet also creates new forms of vulnerability and surveillance. Economic systems promise liberty of choice, while sometimes creating conditions of insecurity that limit genuine freedom of action. The wisdom lies not in rejecting these systems, but in thoughtfully adjusting them, finding the sweet spot where innovation and protection coexist. Today's world constantly tests this balance in public and private life. Consider how you navigate your own personal relationships. The freedom to be authentic with another person requires the security of trust, the safety of knowing that your vulnerability will not be exploited. In our communities, the liberty to pursue different lifestyles and beliefs flourishes best when there are shared agreements about mutual respect and protection. Even in our individual inner lives, we experience this balance. The freedom to take creative risks grows strongest when we have established routines and safeguards that give us the confidence to explore. Hobbes understood that human beings are not solitary creatures struggling against their environment, but social beings whose greatest achievements come through cooperation, whose deepest satisfactions arise when freedom and security are not enemies but partners in the dance of living. The philosopher's genius lies in showing us that this balance is not accidental but intentional, something we must actively cultivate through thoughtful social agreements, through the patient work of building institutions that serve both our need for safety and our hunger for authentic expression. Viewers can apply this wisdom by aligning choices with both safety and authentic expression. Or in your daily life, notice when you feel torn between security and freedom, and ask, how might I negotiate this tension rather than submit to it? Perhaps it's in career choices, seeking opportunities that provide both financial stability and creative fulfillment. Perhaps it's in relationships, building connections that offer both emotional safety and genuine intimacy. Perhaps it's in civic participation, supporting policies that protect individual liberties while strengthening community bonds. The path forward is not in choosing sides, but in developing the wisdom to navigate the space between, to find the creative solutions that honor both our need for security and our hunger for authentic living. As our philosophical journey together draws to its close, we can rest in the understanding that Hobbes's greatest gift is not his vision of our darkness, but his confidence in our capacity to build light together, one thoughtful agreement at a time. What if everything we pursue is ultimately a search for peace? Remember that dangerous insight I mentioned at the beginning, the one Hobbes buried in his philosophy? Here it is. This question, which has followed us through our journey into the shadows of human nature, now emerges in the quiet evening light as our final reflection. Thomas Hobbes, in his Contemplation of Life Without Governance, gave us not merely a political theory, but an enduring insight into the deepest longings of the human heart. The philosopher who described the war of all against all discovered, perhaps without intending to, that beneath every impulse toward conflict lies a desperate yearning for the opposite, for calm, for safety, for the simple gift of resting without fear. And here's the paradox that troubled Hobbes until his final days. The very mechanisms we create for peace, the sovereign power, the social contract, the surrender of freedom, can themselves become sources of oppression. This is what most people miss about Hobbes. He wasn't advocating for tyranny. He was warning us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance, not against chaos from below, but against the corrupting nature of power itself. Tonight, as we sit in the comfort of our own chosen peace, we can recognize this profound paradox, that our greatest fears and our deepest hopes spring from the same source. Undeniable, that horrible feeling you've experienced, the one where you realize the systems meant to protect you might be the very things constraining you. That's the Hobbesian dilemma in its purest form. And so, we can gently turn our attention to our own time, to the world we inhabit now. In our contemporary landscape, with its endless streams of information, its rapid social changes, its economic uncertainties and political divisions, do we not recognize the same fundamental desire Hobbes identified centuries ago? The modern individual, scrolling through social media feeds, racing through traffic, juggling endless responsibilities, participates in a different kind of war. A war not of physical violence, but of attention, of status, of finding meaning in an increasingly complex world. Yet beneath this surface turbulence, what are we truly seeking? We seek the same peace Hobbes described. The peace that comes from knowing our basic needs will be met, from understanding the rules by which we play, from trusting that our efforts will not be crushed by forces beyond our control. This is not weakness. It is the recognition of our shared humanity. You've been wrestling with this throughout the entire video, haven't you? That tension between wanting freedom and needing security. Between desiring authenticity and requiring structure. This is the eternal human condition. Let us consider how this insight transforms our understanding of daily life. When we choose patience over frustration in traffic, when we respond to disagreement with curiosity rather than anger, when we invest in relationships instead of accumulating possessions, We are participating in the social contract Hobbes envisioned, not the formal agreements between governments, but the quiet, personal contracts we make with ourselves and others to create islands of peace in the vast ocean of potential conflict. The ancient wisdom reminds us that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice, of dignity, of mutual recognition. In our personal relationships, in our communities, in our daily choices, we have the opportunity to embody this vision, to be the calm in someone else's storm, to be the stability in another person's uncertainty. This is how philosophy becomes living wisdom, not through abstract contemplation alone, but through the daily practice of choosing peace. And so our long journey through the mind of Thomas Hobbes reaches its gentle conclusion. The philosopher who taught us about the shadows of human nature also revealed to us our capacity for covenant, for trust, for building something beautiful together. The war of all against all was never his final word. It was his beginning, his invitation to imagine something better, something more worthy of our deepest aspirations. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you this final insight, that every choice to seek understanding over judgment, every moment of choosing compassion over fear, every decision to build rather than tear down, participates in humanity's oldest project, the project of creating peace. You are not separate from this great work. You are its continuation. Rest now in the peace that comes from knowing your search for peace is shared by countless others, and that together we are building the foundations of a more gentle world.